Hi, everybody. I'm Catenya McHenry, Communications Director at the McCombs School of Business, and you are joining us on our Work From Home edition of our Big Idea Show, where we delve deeper into faculty research happening here in the McCombs School of Business. Today, we're focusing on an op-ed written by one of our professors by the name of Dr. Edward Anderson. He is in our IROM department, which is Information Risk Operations Management. His op-ed focuses on supply chain, why people are hoarding, rationing, and a term called the Bullwhip Effect, where we're talking about the effect the coronavirus has had on the supply chain, consumers, consumer buying, purchasing, etc. So thank you so much for joining us today, and it's good to see you.
It's my pleasure, Catenya. Thank you for asking me to speak with you.
Absolutely. So one of your specialties is supply chain, and so we are obviously in the midst of the coronavirus, and if you've gone to the store recently, you've noticed that a lot of items are gone and they're really hard to restock. So toilet paper was the first thing to go. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about why that's happening, and then we'll talk about what you've deemed as what's called the bullwhip effect. So let's talk about first why certain items seem to be popular and how that cycle just continues to I guess to fester as people see that certain items are disappearing, and then they get into this cycle where they feel like they need that particular thing. So let's talk about toilet paper first.
Oh, can I start with beans and dried goods first, because that makes things a little bit easier.
Okay.
So what happens is, people are worried that for a couple of weeks, maybe, that what's going to happen is they're not going to be able to get food because they can't leave the house or something like that. And so the first thing they do is they think, well, I want stuff that'll last a while because, who knows when I'm actually going to get to it. And so the first things that are bought up are beans, rice, dried pasta, Italian sauce, and so on. And then once that starts running out, and frankly, people at some point, once you have a pantry full of beans and dried pasta, you really don't want to eat anymore. And so what they go for next are things that are semi-perishable, like eggs. They're going to go bad in a couple of weeks or so, but they'll last a while. And then, so those are the next things that disappear. And then once that happens, people start looking at, once the eggs are gone, they start looking at fresh produce because it's the only thing left. And you can only have a couple of days of that on hand.
Yeah.
Now, where toilet paper comes in is it's even less perishable than beans, right?
Right.
And it's even worse than beans in another way because, you can take those beans, you can take that pasta, and you can put it in your pantry, and it'll just sit there. The thing is, toilet paper, paper toweling, and so on, you have to use those every day, so they actually do have to be replenished. And so there's a tendency not just to create that initial hoard, but then you have to keep doing it.
Huh.
And this plays into the hoarding mechanism, why this hoarding happens. And the reason hoarding happens is there's essentially 4 phases to it. First, you have some people who are just saying, I might be stuck in my house. Think of them as people who like to prepare. They're kind of, they're just cautious. They plan ahead. Mm-hmm. And so they say, well, maybe I should have an extra 2 weeks of food on hand, right? Because I don't know when I'm going to go out. I don't know how severe the lockdown is going to be, and so on. And then other people, they talk to those people who are buying a little extra, and they get the idea, well, if they're doing that, maybe it's a good idea. I'll buy some more too. And then what happens is the shelves start depleting. And then people who might not have bought more otherwise think, oh my, those shelves are going away. I'm not even going to be able to get my normal consumption. So I better get in there and grab that stuff while it's still there.
Right.
And, once you do that, the people who are preparing, they get even more nervous because they're planning ahead, and maybe they're just they're foresightful,
Yeah.
and it just starts feeding on itself in a frenzy.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, even if you have some people who don't participate in that initially, you've got the media. What are they all talking about? It's like all this stuff, the supermarkets, they're empty, the shelves are empty. And so that just feeds the frenzy. And oh, by the way, the thing they love to concentrate on is toilet paper. And so that's the first thing to go.
Yeah. Well, and it becomes this ricochet effect too, because that happened to me. I'm not a hoarder, but then when I started seeing things disappear, it became the psychological thing where what happened to me is exactly what you said. I thought, oh my gosh, I might as well go ahead and get some, because when I need it, I might not have it. So it's become this ricochet effect, and it's crazy how it's like that for one particular item. Well, Ed, there's something that you refer to in your paper called the bullwhip effect. Can you talk about that and explain what that is?
This is how it works. We see a surge of purchasing at a supermarket. And those supermarkets have to be supplied by somebody. And they're supplied by a distributor from their inventory. Of course, the distributor eventually is going to run out of inventory, so they have to buy things from a producer. And if you go really back, the producers are going to buy from a grower, like you were talking about in our conversations earlier. And that linkage from consumer through producer, and then, we could also include perhaps the growers, all those links in the chain are called a supply chain, because what happens is you start out with a supermarket. They have a supplier, which is their distributor. The distributor has a supplier that's its factory, and so on. And honestly, depending on the product, that supply chain may have more or fewer links, depending. But it all works the same. Now, as to what the bullwhip effect is, what happens is, the supermarkets see an increase of increase of purchases.
Mm-hmm.
And when they say increase of purchases, it may look something like this. Okay. So kind of like this. Now, for a number of reasons, some of which are, people tend to panic a little bit. And when I say people, this would be people at the distributor, the planners, some of which is they panic a little bit, some of which is has to do with if they see more demand, they want to adjust their inventories upwards to deal with more surges. Anyhow, the net effect is that purchasers go like this, and then what's going to happen is the distributors are going to increase their orders to the factories by even faster. Right. So it's going to become more vertical. Right. And that change in orders is going to speed up and become steeper as you go further and further back in the supply chain.
Right. And that's happening right now. One of the grocery stores, H-E-B, they have vowed to make sure that things stay stocked on the shelves. So they're increasing the number of trucks that are delivering groceries and items to the grocery stores. But you say at some point that's going to crash, because after we get through this, they'll have more than they actually need. So where do you stop it? Because everybody, I think, is reacting, right? At every point, there is reaction, whether it's from the consumer or the suppliers or the grocers or the grocery stores and the growers.
Right. And so, first of all, sometime this lockdown is going to stop. The other thing is that, you look in your pantry and you realize that you've got enough food and maybe enough toilet paper to last you to Christmas.
Yes.
At that point, you can't buy any more than your normal consumption.
Right.
And so what's going to happen is, at first there was this huge increase in purchases. So there's this huge increase in purchases, and then there's going to be a crash. And so it's going to look like that.
Yeah.
And so what that means is, oh yeah, the bullwhip effect is going to work in this direction too. So consumers drop their purchases some, and then the distributors are going to drop their purchases even faster.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to go up the chain until you get to the factory, and they're in a bad situation because they're going to have to drop their production.
Right.
And what does that mean? If they idle their capacity, some of that capacity is workers. So they're stuck with this situation where, they don't have a high margin business. They may have to lay off their workers.
Yeah.
And so it gets rather ugly really fast as you go up the supply chain. By the way, truckers will also be affected. The truckers right now, they're just working crazy hard. And you've read that in the news. Actually, my son is a manager in the trucking industry, and he's just told me it's crazy. It's higher than any holidays business that they've ever seen.
Yeah.
And so what's going to happen is they too, hopefully they're making a lot of money now, because a lot of those guys are going to be idle eventually.
Well, and you mentioned the other day when we were talking about this, just preparing for this interview today, is that eventually that's going to create a lot of waste, because if everyone's overproducing, people are overbuying and panic buying, at some point they're not going to need all of that, and then at some point you're going to have all this extra stuff, and then what do you do with all the extra stuff?
Right. And hopefully most of the extra stuff is what we were talking about earlier. Toilet paper, rice, pasta. That's good for a long time. So eventually it'll be eaten up. And that's perfectly fine. If people have a lot of meat stored up or vegetables, that's not so great, because that stuff can't keep. Not quite as worried about that. Realistically, for the consumer, this isn't going to be that bad once things let up.
Yeah.
But it's going to be bad for our people up the supply chain. Mm-hmm. The truckers, the distributors, and the factories are all going to have serious problems, because that initial boom from hoarding is going to turn into a bust.
Yeah.
And the interesting part about all this is really the average demand hasn't changed, right?
Right.
But even though the average demand hasn't changed, you've got all this boom and bust effect, which is really harmful to companies that are up the supply chain. And in fact, it's actually harmful to HEB and their equivalents, because they're hiring people overtime as well. And that's a really low margin business.
Right.
And HEB in particular, they won't gouge the customers. So at some point, they're going to lose money.
Yeah. Well, it also seems like it's difficult for growers and also the grocery stores to know how much to purchase. Like, how do they figure out, based on how much people are buying, how much they need to request of a certain product? Say if for instance, carrots was the thing that people were buying most. How do they decide, how do they make decisions on how much they actually need? Or do they just say, just grow as many as you can and send us as many as you can? How do they know? Because it seems like there has to be a balance, and there has to be a science that's applied to it. So how do they know?
There is a science. It's called forecasting, right? The problem is those forecasts assume that something like normal behavior is going on.
Right.
And
And it's not normal.
it's not. And as soon as you have these huge changes, then the forecasting models tend to break down.
Right.
That's part of the reason why you get the overreactions. And so forecasting models don't really help.
Right.
At least not much. Basically, they're just going to say, hey, demand's going up. And oh, by the way, those forecasting models, even if they track well going up, which they actually won't, they'll tend to lag. They're not very good at catching when demand starts dropping.
Yeah.
Because you have to look at past data to actually make a forecast. If you're looking at stuff that's a week or 2 weeks out in this sort of situation, the crash is going to happen much faster.
Right.
And so it's frankly a mess.
Yeah. So in your years of studying this, you've been looking at this for a very long time. Have you seen anything like this before? I mean, we haven't had anything this bad, but I think we've had other instances and situations where we've been in a recession. But have you seen it this bad before?
Not this bad.
Yeah.
But at a lower level, this goes on all the time. It's less noticeable in supermarkets. But at one time, we were talking about toilet paper.
Yeah.
What happened is that, supermarkets would occasionally have promotions, sales. They would mark their toilet paper down as kind of a loss leader to bring people in. And the problem is that would increase sales somewhat. And then the suppliers would increase sales even more. And actually, that has to do with forecasting. It tends to overstate increases, especially because companies not only have to increase their demand, but they also have to increase their inventory. So both things are going on at once, even though we're not dealing with a crazy situation. This is all rational. But still, the increase is going to be faster with the suppliers, and then that's going to go to the distributors and back to the factory. And so those promotions create a lot of problems. And at Procter & Gamble, it was estimated at one time that 80% of the purchases of, say, toilet paper from the factory were during those promotion periods. And so they were having real booms and busts. Mm-hmm. And eventually Procter & Gamble figured out how to deal with that.
All right, so last question. How long do you think it's going to take for the crash to happen? And then how long I guess two questions. How long do you think it's going to take for the crash to happen? And then how long do you think it will take to normalize?
That is a very good question. So there's already some normalization going on because supermarkets like H-E-B are practicing rationing. Mm-hmm. That's calming this rapid increase in demand already. And so things are kind of returning back to normal. They're not really normal as opposed to like when we don't have to deal with the coronavirus, but they're better than they were. And so what's happening is the purchase increases are stabilizing and they're not crashing. Mm-hmm. So that's a good thing because all of that is passed up the supply chain, and so things are getting a little easier in the factories and so forth. And oh, by the way, this is crucial. Because of the rationing, people like myself, we go into the supermarket and we actually see eggs and meat there. Maybe not a lot, but we go every day for about 3 days and it's always there. There's always some. And so then I calm down. And then it kicks that hoarding cycle into reverse. Huh. And so that's good too.
Yeah.
Ultimately, when is the crash going to occur? Realistically, it depends on the lockdown when that's lifted. And That's really dependent on the progress of the coronavirus,
Right.
which could last a long time. But the real issue that is going to affect that is when the lockdowns are lifted.
Right. Right.
And you know what? If I could predict that, I'd be laying down a lot of money.
Yeah. I'd be investing in you.
Yeah. So I don't know about that.
Yeah.
All I can say is that, this bust is, going to happen within a year. Almost all the models you look at of coronavirus propagation start decreasing somewhere around, it really depends on what actions are taken, but let's say worst case, things start letting off start becoming a little more reasonable about September. My suspicion is that the lockdowns will be removed long before then.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, they almost have to.
Right.
So it really depends. Ask the administration and the mayor of Austin when they're going to reduce the lockdowns, and then we'll see a bust relatively soon thereafter.
Yeah. Well, it'll be nice to see certain items back on the shelves again and consistently back on the shelves again. Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Ed Anderson, for joining us and giving us great insight into what's happening, rationing, supply chain, and also the bullwhip effect. So thank you for joining us today. We will see you next time.
Thank you. I really enjoyed speaking with you, Catenya, as always.
Thank you. All right, we'll speak to you soon.